when Cuba's free, I get the first hotel. Is that true?
We have some very good plans for Cuba. I think, we have to get rid of the regime was very tough, very nasty. The difference is now they don't have money coming in. And speaking of Cuba, after many, many decades, it's coming our way.
The US president seems obsessed with Cuba and is becoming more and more open about wanting to take the island. This communist state lies just 90 miles off the US coast, and it's now going through the worst crisis in its recent history. Since Trump returned to the White House and with Venezuela's former president Nicolas Maduro captured, everything seems to have sped up. Cuba's economy is on the brink of collapse, while Washington keeps piling more pressure on the regime. So, is Trump simply trying to take advantage of a government that's already on its knees? Why now? And how far are the United States prepared to go? Let's break it all down.
Cuba is ready to fall.
Yes.
Cuba looks like it's ready to fall.
No quisiera ver ni en un laboratorio lo que sería una agresión a Cuba por parte de los Estados Unidos.
El presidente Trump ofrece una nueva vía entre Estados Unidos y una nueva Cuba.
Algo tiene que pasar, porque así no podemos seguir viviendo, porque no estamos muriendo de hambre.
To understand why Cuba is going through the worst crisis in its recent history, we need to go back in time. In 1898, the United States stepped into the Spanish-American War and took control of Cuba until it gained its independence in 1902. For decades afterwards, the island remained under Washington's control and influence. But everything changed in 1959. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara overthrew the regime of Fulgencio Batista, who was backed by the United States with military and political support, while American companies controlled much of Cuba's economy. Right in the middle of the Cold War, Cuba joined the communist bloc. This revolution deeply alarmed Washington, which saw this growing alliance with the Eastern Bloc as a serious threat. After all, the island sits just 90 miles, around 145 kilometers, off the US coast, located in the Caribbean Sea and along some of the world's most strategic shipping routes.
It also really went against a very long-standing historical tradition and perception, if you will, of Cuba as being close to the United States. This sort of created a double dynamic. The first was the politics, the threat of the Soviet Union having an outpost so close to the United States. And indeed, in 1961, we saw the Soviet Union try to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. So the threat was real in that case. The second was, of course, the issue of expropriations, of the aggrieved former property and business holders of Cuba who went to the United States and basically lobbied the United States to impose some restrictions that led to the embargo of 1961, in part justified by these expropriations.
Fidel Castro then established a one-party communist regime with a centrally planned economy and tight control over society. It was a system that promised equal access to healthcare, education, food, and energy for everyone.
They were told in schools and everything, todos somos iguales. Everybody's equal. But that wasn't even true in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, in the 70s and the 80s, if you were part of the high political elite, if you were part of the Castro dynasty, but beyond that, if you were part of the high elite of the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of the Armed Forces, the Council of State, the Communist Party, you got things that nobody else got.
But behind that promise of equality, the gap kept growing between most of the population and a small minority who managed to get around the system through the black market and financial support from the Cuban diaspora. Things became even worse in 1961 when the United States imposed a full economic embargo on Cuba, which is still in place today.
What it meant was basically it prohibited U.S. firms from doing business with the Cuban government. That includes investments, financial transactions, as well as commerce, imports and exports.
However, Cuba managed to keep going for many years thanks to the Soviet Union and Venezuela. From 1999, Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez was sending the island nearly 100,000 barrels of oil every single day, providing a lifeline for a country that depended heavily on imported goods and energy.
Cuba does produce about 40% of its own oil and its own energy needs through solar parks and other means, but 60% comes from abroad, and it always has.
But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba was plunged into a severe economic crisis, often compared to the one it's facing today. 30 years later, Trump's return to the White House marked another major shift. Washington ramped up sanctions, tightened the pressure on the Cuban regime, and moved to cut off its last remaining economic lifelines. And you'll probably remember these images from January 2026. Venezuela's former president Maduro was captured during a US operation.
It actually was January 9th, after the extraction of Nicolas Maduro. The US basically said to the interim government, now clearly under the thumb of the United States, saying, cut off all the oil being shipped to Cuba.
Almost overnight, Cuba lost its main source of oil. Apart from a single Russian tanker that arrived in March 2026, supplies were nowhere near enough to meet the country's needs.
But the blockade basically came upon an economy that was already struggling to deliver food, produce enough. Most of its food is imported. Most of its medicines are imported.
Already on the brink, Cuba's economy finally tipped over the edge. The US embargo has certainly played a role, but it doesn't explain everything. The Castro-era economic model is also largely to blame. Heavy centralization, a reliance on imports, and reforms that delayed for decades have led Cuba into a dead end.
El país está viviendo un momento difícil. Y nosotros que somos los de a pie, como decimos, somos los que más lo sufrimos.
Fuel, medicine and basic food shortages have brought much of the country to a standstill. Power cuts leave millions without electricity for hours, sometimes even days. Hospitals are struggling to function. Rubbish is piling up in the streets, and people's purchasing power has collapsed. A single meal can now cost the equivalent of a month's salary. Those who can afford it turn to the black market for medicine, fuel, mobile phones and other essentials that have disappeared from state-run shops. Despite the crisis, Havana is trying to regain control. Late June 2026, the government unveiled a sweeping package of 176 economic reforms. The plan includes opening the financial sector to private banks, allowing private investors to buy stakes in some state-owned companies, and gradually ending several state monopolies. The government insists these reforms are a sovereign decision, but many observers believe they are also aimed at persuading Washington to ease the pressure.
Donc quand on dit le changement, en tout cas, ces mesures, c'est plutôt une garantie adressée notamment aux États-Unis pour que ces derniers desserrent les taux, entre autres, mais c'est aussi une garantie, c'est pour le régime une manière d'assurer sa stabilité et de s'assurer de rester en place dans cette transition-là qui va finalement être contrôlée.
But will these reforms be enough to save the regime? According to the United Nations, Cuba is now on the brink of both a humanitarian and financial crisis, and even Trump admits it.
You know, Cuba's a disaster.
So, if Cuba is in such a desperate situation, why is Trump so interested in the island now?
Les intérêts de Trump, c'est d'abord une stratégie de puissance hémisphérique, réactiver cette doctrine Monroe, reprendre le contrôle, mais ça à l'échelle de toute l'Amérique latine, en soutenant des gouvernements plutôt d'extrême droite. Et Cuba, ça reste un peu le caillou dans la chaussure, le régime communiste à quelques encablures.
The first reason is ideological. Historically, the goal of successive US administrations was to win the political support of Cubans who had fled the regime and settled in the United States.
We are here today to honor the Cubans and Cuban Americans who strengthen America with their character and with their enterprise.
I'm appealing to the young people of Cuba who will lift something up, build something new. El futuro de Cuba tiene que estar en las manos del pueblo cubano.
And then there's Trump's speech.
But for 50 years I've been hearing, as a little boy, I'd be hearing about Cuba. You know, Cuba's a disaster. but I've been hearing so much about Cuba, but Cuba is in its last moments of life.
If he were to follow through on those statements, he would be remembered as the president who truly changed Cuba's future.
For Donald Trump, this 67 years means that it would be a legacy for him if he could create this change.
But there are also political reasons behind all this. First, the US midterm elections are getting closer, and Trump's approval ratings have fallen in recent months. He promised peace to his supporters, but the conflict with Iran has made him increasingly unpopular. And there's another reason too. Today, nearly 2.5 million people of Cuban origin live in the United States, with a large share of them based in Florida. Since the 1959 revolution, more than 2 million Cubans left the island, making the Cuban diaspora one of the country's most politically influential communities. A significant part of that community remains fiercely opposed to the government in Havana and plays a major role in Florida politics, a key battleground state in US elections. That influence is also reflected inside the Trump administration through Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
Marco Rubio, il représente toute une communauté en Floride d'exilés cubains qui sont très opposés à la normalisation des relations avec le régime.
Rubio was born in Florida to Cuban parents who left the island before the revolution, and he grew up in Miami's large Cuban-American community, building much of his political career around Cuba.
So the future of Cuba belongs to the people of Cuba in terms of how they're governed, what the system looks like, and so forth. But the national security threat, that's 100% something we're going to focus on because that's about America.
And while he and Trump both take a hard line on the regime, their motivations are different. Rubio has spent years pushing for the communist regime to fall without offering any concessions. Meanwhile, Trump mainly sees Cuba as a strategic asset for US interests.
He wants to be the first Hispanic president, and he plans on running in 2028. If he can't deliver political change in Cuba, especially after Donald Trump started this, it will seriously hurt his potential to run and compete and get the Republican nomination.
But his interests go far beyond politics.
Donald Trump is not interested in anything that doesn't make money for him.
Before he became US president, Trump made his name as a businessman.
D'un autre côté, il y a aussi le mania de l'immobilier auquel on peut penser en la personne de Donald Trump, qui avait d'ailleurs, d'une manière absolument cynique, marketé une Riviera à Gaza, une Riviera Trump à Gaza. Bon, Cuba, c'est historiquement la Riviera des États-Unis.
Before the revolution, Cuba was a favorite destination for American tourists who came to spend their holiday on the island and invest in hotels, casinos, and real estate. Trump himself said back in 1999,
When Cuba's free, I get the first hotel. Is that true?
but it's not just about beaches and luxury hotels. Cuba sits in a strategic position at the heart of the Caribbean, close to the main shipping lanes linking the Gulf of Mexico, the US East Coast, and the Panama Canal. That means a significant share of maritime traffic between the Atlantic and North America passes close to the island. Not only global trade, but also drug trafficking and other criminal activities. Ideology, domestic politics, economic interest, strategic influence, Donald Trump's reasons are wide-ranging. The real question now is, how far is he ready to go? First, there's the most extreme scenario, a military intervention. For months now, Trump has repeatedly talked about his desire to take Cuba.
Maybe we'll have a friendly takeover of Cuba.
Comments like these have fueled speculation about a possible US intervention.
Ce qu'on peut voir, c'est une activation d'un dispositif militaire autour de Cuba. En réalité, Donald Trump a déjà déployé, donc il y a déjà un déploiement militaire dans la Caraïbe depuis l'été dernier. C'est un peu ce qui a précédé la capture de Nicolás Maduro au Venezuela, son enlèvement même, sous couvert de lutte contre le narcotrafic dans la zone des Caraïbes.
According to the BBC, 5 US surveillance aircraft and 3 American drones have been regularly flying over the area around Cuba since May 11. Militarily, there's simply no comparison. Even though Cuba has recently acquired several hundred drones, its armed forces with around 50,000 troops would stand little chance against the world's most powerful military in a conventional war. Even so, the Cuban government insists it's ready to fight back.
Y hemos desatado un plan de preparación para elevar la disposición para la defensa de nuestro pueblo en interés de la guerra de todo el pueblo, que es nuestra concepción de defensa y que es una concepción defensiva, no agresiva.
While Cuba would probably struggle to withstand the US invasion, several experts believe any ground operation could quickly turn into a long and costly insurgency. For many analysts, Trump would ultimately have far more to lose than to gain from a military intervention.
In the case of Iran, they realized that you can't force regime change from air raids, from the air. Did they learn that lesson? I don't know.
Another possibility is a scenario similar to what happened in Venezuela. After Maduro's capture, some have speculated that Washington could try to target Raúl Castro, the brother of Fidel Castro, who remains wanted by the United States, or even the actual Cuban president, Miguel Diaz-Canel. But once again, experts urge caution.
This is not Venezuela. It's not one or two leaders that you can take out and find someone else to replace them willingly. It's a revolutionary government that's incredibly solidified, incredibly top-down and vertical.
The first part is the one about whether the United States would be successfully able to extract somebody of great symbolic value, like Raúl Castro. I don't think anybody cares about Miguel Diaz-Canel on the island or elsewhere. You know, he's a puppet, and he's not had any kind of strong presence in policymaking. He's been seen as an enforcer.
But there's a third possibility, which is far less visible. On May 14, 2026, for the first time, the director of the CIA traveled to Cuba. Officially, no negotiations were announced, but several experts believe talks are taking place behind the scenes between Washington and Havana.
Parce qu'on le sait maintenant depuis des mois, il y a bel et bien des négociations entre Washington et la Havane.
But these negotiations are not formalized. We're not talking. There's no negotiating table. There are no mediators. This is completely ad hoc and it's completely personal.
So who exactly is Washington talking to? Part of the answer may lie with Gaesa, the powerful military-run conglomerate created in the 1990s. Often described as a state within a state, it controls a huge share of Cuba's strategic economy, from tourism to infrastructure. The identity of the people involved in these talks remains unknown, but one thing is clear: Washington is continuing to turn up the pressure.
En Estados Unidos estamos listos para abrir un nuevo capítulo en la relación entre nuestra gente y nuestros países. Y actualmente, lo único que se interpone en el camino hacia un mejor futuro son quienes controlan su país.
In reality, everything suggests that the Trump administration now favors a different strategy. Rather than direct military action, Washington appears to be betting on steadily tightening sanctions, cutting the regime off from its resources, and deepening its economic crisis.
No, there won't be escalation. I don't think there needs to be. Look, the place is falling apart. It's a mess.
Right now, it seems that Donald Trump launched a policy of trying to deny Cuban resources, the Cuban government resources, increasing sanctions, including on individuals and companies, all with the idea of forcing either a collapse of the government or some form of popular protest that would bring about the collapse of the government.
After decades of US sanctions, growing frustrations among many Cubans is also being directed at their own government. But in a country where dissent remains tightly controlled and political opponents are regularly jailed, a popular uprising still seems difficult to imagine.
There is a risk of basically this becoming a failed state. And worse, a failed state with pockets of criminality, particularly along the northern coast.
Trump may never send troops into Cuba, but he may not even need to.
Cuba est plus que jamais seul face à la prédation des États-Unis.
As the sanctions tighten and the crisis deepens, Washington appears to be pursuing a different strategy, pushing the Cuban regime to its limits in the hope that it eventually collapses from within. The question now is whether the Cuban government can once again survive.